welcome to Candid Conversations on our blog at one-on-one-candidconversations.blogspot.com, and of course our YouTube channel. You're going to see just one half of the conversation today because the cameras decided not to work, but that's okay. We have on today with us Kevin Hazzard. He's an author and also a professional as well in the art of being a paramedic, and he's been writing books as well, and he recently wrote one that got my attention, and I thought, wow, I got to talk to this guy because this book is really interesting. It's called American Sirens: The Incredible Story of the Black Men Who Became America's First Paramedics. And I thought, hey, this is really interesting. So we have him today here, and he's going to join us in a zoomed-in conversation. Kevin, welcome. Thanks for dropping in today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. So this, I have to be honest, was a real surprise to me. When I heard you on Fresh Air, I thought, wait a minute, I thought LA was the birthplace of paramedics. I thought it was Los Angeles County. I thought it was, we see Randolph Mantooth and Kevin Tighe in Emergency, the old Emergency show. And we go, that's where it originated, California. But no, it's not so. That was a real shocker to me. And was that a surprise to you to find out that the true history of paramedics in the United States, and probably also here in Canada, really developed in another place? In this case, I believe Pittsburgh, right?
Yeah, Pittsburgh. I mean, I was as shocked as anybody. When I went to paramedic school, my instructor was one of the first 6 medics in the state of Georgia. So I was sort of steeped in the history of the days, kind of pre-organization, I guess you would say, when, mostly it was, people coming out of funeral homes, driving hearses, very disorganized. I knew the lack of training. I knew everything that preceded and called for the change that started in the late 60s and early 70s, but I had no idea where it began. I think probably like you, I just assumed maybe Los Angeles, although you also hear, Miami and Seattle up there as cities early on. Certainly would not have anticipated that it came from Pittsburgh, nor that it had, the rich history, this incredible story that it did.
Yeah, and that's a real mind blower for me, because that flips everything upside down from the story that we have of paramedics. We think of Los Angeles as the birthplace of it, or at least that's what I thought. And I was a devotee of the show. I really loved it and was really into it back in the day. So to have that kind of shattered in a way, but in a positive way, is really interesting. And this story is really interesting. It's about a group of Black men who were part of something called Freedom House. Can you describe what Freedom House was really all about, what these guys did?
Freedom House began its life as an employment office. It was a nonprofit set up by a civil rights leader, specifically to bring job opportunities or job training opportunities to people living in the Hill District of Pittsburgh. Hill District, if you imagine, at least, from my American point of view, if you think of neighborhoods like Harlem or Watts or the south side of Chicago, that is essentially what the Hill District is in Pittsburgh. It's a, low income, almost entirely Black neighborhood. And this guy named Jim McCoy set up the organization and was kind of having trouble finding the right opportunity. He didn't want to just train people to be gardeners or housekeepers. He was looking for, a sort of aspirational job. And Freedom House kind of, in some way sort of, came to him from multiple directions. But, a lot of people were involved in bringing ambulance care to Freedom House. But because of what he did, which he was able to provide manpower. The two people who had the idea to create emergency medicine, or pre-hospital emergency medicine, approached him. Mm-hmm. So that's where the name comes from. The name comes from this organization that was trying to build, job training opportunities and just, it expanded very quickly, very rapidly into this sort of, very radical, world altering organization that it became.
And that's what it was. It was very radical, very altering. And I mean, this funny thing that you talk about the neighborhoods that these people served, and in particular, as you mentioned, the Hill District in Pittsburgh. It sounds like it was a largely ignored part of the city, and it took somebody who is, and for lack of a better word, excuse me for this, but basically a rich guy, politician, somebody in power who died, basically, who got this kind of kick-started. Is that a good assessment? Is that a real way of looking at that, or am I on the wrong path here?
No, you're 100% on. So there's a guy by the name of Peter Saffer, who is an Austrian-born anesthesiologist who done a lot by this point in his life. I mean, he had single-handedly invented CPR as we know it today. He was part inventor of the modern ICU. He would go on later in life to be nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize in Medicine. And he happened to have a daughter who had a very severe case of asthma, who died one night from an asthma attack. By the time she got to the hospital where he was working, he actually took over her care. She was brain dead because she had not received oxygen from the time that the asthma attack began when she was at home until she arrived at the hospital. So he was acutely aware of what was missing from our medical system. He was acutely aware of what was possible, and he was exactly the sort of person to go out and design these sort of things. So he created in the early 1960s what you would consider the modern paramedic. He designed its training program. He designed how they would be equipped, all the medications that they would carry. He redesigned the ambulance. He had everything but sort of the people. And very specifically, what he did not have was the political will to put money and resources and time behind this project. He had been trying to get the city of Pittsburgh, where he was living and working at that time, to adopt this idea that he had to create paramedics. The city was resistant, as pretty much every city around the world at that point, had no interest in something like this. And one night in November of 1966, a very famous, very popular politician by the name of David Lawrence died while giving a political speech in front of 2,000 people. And not only did he collapse and ultimately die, but those 2,000 people witnessed the slapstick kind of, rescue that took place once the ambulance service arrived. These guys arrived with no equipment, very little knowledge. They didn't really have any plan of action other than to scoop him up, drag him to their paddy wagon, toss him in the back, and then let him ride by himself. Everybody watched it. They saw that, they arrived with an oxygen canister that was either broken or empty, but either way provided no good. And by the time David Lawrence got to the hospital, he was brain dead. They were able to get back a pulse. They were able to get back a respiratory rate and restore his blood pressure. But he had not been breathing for so long that that they were unable to save his brain. The irony to the situation is that there was a nurse who was on hand that night who immediately started performing CPR. When the police-borne ambulance service arrived, they shoved her aside, scooped up Lawrence, and off they went. So though he had exactly what you would want, which is early and immediate and successful CPR, that was interrupted by the ambulance service. I mean, the irony of that is, was lost on nobody. So the next morning, when the city started kind of shaking off the shock of what they had just witnessed, Peter Saffer comes forward and says, "Okay, there's a plan here. There's a way to do this better, and we can keep this from happening again."
So that's what he does. He sets this up. He begins to put this into action and gets the teams all set up. And what's really more comical as they go along, as you explained in the story on Fresh Air, at one point, it's kind of like Keystone Cops, because they start going out on runs, and what happens is they're competing with the police and the funeral homes at one point, which is really weird. Because here they are running to scenes, trying to get these people save their lives, and you have the police and these other people who are not trained interfering with them, instead of saying, oh, wait a minute. It took a little time for them to sort of click in and realize, wait a minute, maybe we might want to start working with these guys to, to get something done. Well, it must have been very frustrating for the people at Freedom House doing this, to face that on a daily basis, along with the discrimination that they also had to endure as well, in the work they were doing. Can you tell me a little bit about what their daily life was really like, along those lines?
So they never managed to get a positive working relationship with the police. That was their biggest challenge on a day-to-day level. So, like I said, prior to Freedom House's arrival, depending on where you lived in the country, if you called for help, that call would be answered either by 2 undertakers from the funeral home, the volunteer fire department, or police officers, none of whom were well equipped, none of whom were well trained. So in Pittsburgh, it was the police. And so when these guys began service in the spring of 1968, they are in a very real way taking jobs away from the police officers, even though this is not, considered a prestigious posting for a cop, even though they do not keep up with their training, even though they're, as evidenced by the death of David Lawrence, even though they are not terribly effective at what they do, it's nonetheless their job. So there's resistance on that front. But on a, deeper, sort of more insidious level, the police force is almost entirely white. Freedom House is entirely Black. And it comes from not just anywhere, but from a neighborhood that has a long history of an antagonistic relationship with the police, and where the power imbalance is so, outrageously in favor of the police that these guys have almost no recourse should the cops tell them to sit down and shut up, which happens time and again. They will arrive on scene only to find that the police have tried to beat them there. The cops will provide very poor care, but because they're the police and they have more power, they're able to tell these Freedom House paramedics who have, the most rigorous training program that the world had seen to this point for pre-hospital medicine. They're told, hey, you're not wanted here, you're not needed here, just step back and be quiet, or we'll take your ass to jail. That is not an uncommon occurrence. And so it's an incredibly frustrating thing to have worked this hard, to have, uprooted your entire life to become this new thing, to help provide medical care, emergency medical care, critical medical care, life-saving medical care to people in your community, and to have the police say, we're going to do it, the old terrible way, just because we can. In that regard, it was an ongoing frustration for them, although not one that they took lying down. They stole a police scanner, and so that way they could, the way that calls were dispatched at that time was they would be sent to the police first, and so they steal this police scanner so that they can race the cops to the scene, which are, one story after another of these guys racing the cops to the scene and getting there first, and then having to sort of act nonchalant as if they had just sort of happened upon it by accident, because they didn't want them to know what they were doing. And the community begins to see how effective this is, and gets behind it in theory. But of course, an awful lot of people in the white community were not excited about this sort of care being provided to them by Black people. And so they had to deal with that. As you mentioned, there was racism from patients. There were patients who, flat out would say, I would prefer that, you just take me to the hospital, that you not lay your hands on me. It was another thing that they had to overcome. So, these guys are, this is a revolutionary idea in the 1960s. This is something that's going to change ultimately how millions of people live and die around the world. And yet the people who are sort of, on the tip of the spear are having to fight against the most ridiculous of things on a daily basis. And yet, they show up to work every day, and, there's not a single noted instance in which these guys acted inappropriately in any way. I mean, the grace that they showed under tremendous fire is inspiring.
And that's really the legacy of Freedom House, is that grace, that style. When did it all begin to start to change for paramedics as far as this is concerned? When did the dynamic between the police and the other services, and when did this all start to go away and just let these things begin to basically gel into what we see today? Was there a timeline that came into play, or did it?
It depended. It depended largely on where it was. Pittsburgh, to a large degree, is a unique case because it's the only service that is, intentionally and almost entirely Black. So in other cities that followed, whether they were following completely the Freedom House model or, they were sort of doing something of their own, the racial makeup was, generally speaking, largely white, and the response was almost, unequivocally positive. Most cities had no problem adopting EMS. It became, there were always questions about, and this remains to this day, there are questions about how it's going to be funded and staffed and all these other things, and just how robust a system it will be. But there was not the official distrust and pushback that Freedom House received, and it would be very difficult to look at the facts of what happened in the late 60s and early 70s in Pittsburgh and suggest that the trouble that they had spawned from anything other than the race of the people who were providing the work. But in 1965, this thing called the White Paper came out, and that essentially was throwing up a flag to the medical community to say, hey, there's a major problem here. Trained medical professionals are too few to be there when you need them, and too unskilled to be of much use when they are there in the case of an out of the hospital emergency. So that was the first, public statement. And then little by little, that begins to change. Little by little, cities, whether they're adopting the Freedom House model or, again, they're sort of trying to create something of their own, it begins to change in the very late 60s and early 70s. And by 72, in the US anyway, maybe 73, the EMS Act was passed, which finally put some money behind it. But, it was a very slow trickle to get this change made. But the resistance and animosity was faced only by a single service.
That's telling, isn't it? That it was one service that had that pushback, whereas everybody else was like, yeah, let's get on board. But these guys really kind of fought through it, didn't they? It was kind of like an everyday event, and they, as you pointed out, they went in and they just did the work. And if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Sapper, and also there was another person, a nurse, I believe, that also joined in as well, really helped shape them and bring them into the level and the class that was or is considered to be, the A plus, if you will. Can you tell me a little bit about the Mr. Sapper and I believe there was a nurse that also got involved and how they helped shape that group of individuals?
Well, they were both doctors, Peter Saffer and Nancy Caroline, both physicians. Saffer is he's the one who conceives of this idea, but he's not on a day-to-day level. Once their training is over with and they're underway in the late 60s, he's not there all the time. He's also running a very large ICU at a very big university hospital system. He's running a fellowship program. He's starting a resuscitation institute. He still has things going on because, he is the father of CPR. He's developed all these, like the Resusci Annie doll that people have learned CPR on, all over the world since the 1950s. That's something that he developed. So, he has a ton of irons in the fire and is unable to be there every day for Freedom House. And he needs somebody to help, keep the service at the very peak of its performance. Medicine is constantly changing. That is, that's probably the one constant, is that every couple of years, it seems there's a complete overhaul in theory and practice. So he needs somebody to really be on top of it. And the person he selects is a very young doctor by the name of Nancy Caroline. She had just finished her residency in Cleveland, and she came as an ICU fellow under Saffer to Pittsburgh. She arrived and had never heard of a paramedic, had never been on an ambulance, but Saffer sort of buttonholes her one day and quite deliberately and aggressively pursues her to take the job because he needs somebody to do it, and he's essentially been turned down by everybody else. It just so happened to be that this was the perfect marriage. Nancy Caroline was not only a brilliant physician, but a very dedicated, very thorough, very driven individual who go on to do incredible things in her own right, but who really threw herself into the idea of developing a world-class paramedic system. She instantly realized what its value was. And, she knew, hey, the only way that I can really change this and bring these guys to the level that, as high level as can be, is to be here with them every day. So she puts a cot in their crew room and she's running calls with them. She's, essentially living with them, eating with them, working with them. She's there all the time. And the bond that forms between her and the people working at Freedom House endures till the day she dies. In the early 2000s, the view of people from Freedom House, the connection was there. And to this day, if you bring her name up, they all, there's sort of a wistful tone that comes, there was a great deal of affection and trust that was developed from her leadership style, as well as, the connection that they made working together.
That's a pretty amazing thing. And that, Freedom House doesn't exist anymore today. It's no longer around. I think they got folded into the Pittsburgh services as a whole. But their legacy is really continuing today in Pittsburgh. A little bit about the book. What did you start from? Because there's so much information we've just gone over. How did you go about approaching this book?
It felt like it was like trying to, count stars to a certain degree, because there was so much information. I mean, it's difficult, like you said, it's difficult to talk about it because it's such a wide, vast story with so many different tentacles and turns and players. I just, I initially started with the people. Somebody had emailed me and said, have you ever heard of Freedom House? I had not. I started looking into it and realized that nobody had written a definitive account of what had happened. And so I just started reaching out to people and kind of getting the stories of the people who were there. So, there's a number. Unfortunately, not everyone is still alive. This happened. We're talking things that happened 50 years ago and longer. So not everyone is still around, but those who were look back on this as kind of a definitive moment in their lives. And they're aware, maybe they weren't at the time, but they are aware now that they hold a very unique piece of history in their hands. And they have been looking for someone to sort of spread the word. And so when I began calling them, they were very gracious and generous in sharing their story with me. So that's where I began. But, little by little, you interview people, you know how it goes. Somebody says something and, that sort of lets you know that they pull back the curtain, even if it's subconsciously just a bit, and you realize, oh, wait a minute, there's something else back there. And that's kind of how it went. With each new person or each new idea that came into the story, it led to this, it led to a door that once you opened it, you realize, my goodness, there's an even bigger room behind this. So it took a long time to really get as much of this as I could together. And at some point, I had to kind of throw in a towel and say, I think I've done enough here, and I can, this is a pretty significant portion of the story, but there are just so many people and so many, different turns and folds. It's just, it's really a phenomenal story. But the research was a handful, simply because it was so much to unearth.
You kind of like opened up floodgate, didn't you?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah, and it's all this pouring in. So would you say that this book is more or less the history of Freedom House, as well as the story of how paramedics came to be in America? Was that a good analysis of the book?
Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to do was tell the story of how in 1968, at the height of the civil rights movement, in this small town in the United States, 24 Black men changed forever the history of medicine. I wanted to know how they did it. I want to know who they did it. And so, I very much wanted this to read like a novel. I wanted you to understand the people involved and to know what their personal challenges were and where they came from, and how, each of them in a very real, but also in an absolutely spellbinding way, they bring to the table some other part of the equation. And in almost every case, it comes from, some sort of hardship in their background. It comes from some kind of character flaw or something that's driving them. And it was, those are the best stories, the ones where the people involved are, complicated and interesting and intriguing, and, all of their little bits of humanity, combined to create this wonderful narrative. And that's really what it is.
I guess that's the true meat of the book, is the narrative, the story of the Freedom House men who went out there and did this, and the fact that, hey, this is, these are Black men. That's another really important point to bring to the fore, because we're seeing now in history, even in, for example, the NASA program with Hidden Figures. That's another thing that we are seeing, that there are people that are behind this, people of color in particular, who have been a part of this and have made history, have done things and contributed in such a manner that we don't know of until people like yourself begin to read their stories out to us. What did it feel like doing this book? Was it kind of like one of those wake up moments, or was there a lot of wow moments when you were doing this book?
Tons. I mean, some of it, quite frankly, was frustrating because you realize how little the world has changed. Some of it also felt like a tremendous responsibility. Like you said, just because we haven't heard it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And for the people involved, if you take the Hidden Figures example, those women who were those calculators who were behind the scene, working on various types of arithmetic and helping to get us to the moon, they were well aware of what they did. And they were also well aware that their story was not valued enough to be told and remembered. And I'm sure that was a tremendous frustration for them. That's how it was here. When I spoke to these guys, they were aware, as I said earlier, of their place in history. And, I think it has been an enduring frustration for them that the world did not care enough to just sit down and say, well, tell us your part of this story. And so to be handed that, and to have people willing to trust me enough to say, okay, go out and tell the world, I felt a tremendous amount of pressure to do it justice and to do them justice and their contribution justice. And, more than anything, I wanted people to finish the book, so I tried to make it as exciting and as fun as possible, because, you're right. There are a ton of moments where you kind of go, oh my God, I cannot believe this happened. How does the world not know? And, that I just felt the responsibility was on me to make sure that, to the best of my ability, I got that story out.
And you certainly did a good job of it, from what I can see, because you're getting all kinds of attention. What's the reaction been like to American Sirens? How people who have come across the book taken it? What's the feedback you've been getting?
I mean, I think from the general reader, it has been sort of one of surprise and delight, and people are, equal parts frustrated and entertained by the story, which is good. That's what you hope for with something like this. I think from people who were involved in one way or another, it is, they have been very appreciative, which is, an incredibly humbling thing. And, for the EMS community, I was, to a degree, that was the one I was kind of uncertain about, because, as you said, a lot of people, generations of people have been, have joined this job specifically because they watched Emergency. And, that has endured as the creation myth of EMS. And I would argue, and I think this book argues, that EMS already has a creation myth. And it's actually, an even wilder story than Hollywood dreamt up when it created the television show Emergency. So I was not sure how they were going to react, because, EMS people love to get into the sort of arcana of EMS history. Mm-hmm. And their reaction has really been fantastic. People are delighted to know this piece of history, to have it highlighted and brought to the fore, for them to, to know it. And, EMS instructors have said, oh, I'm teaching this to my students now. I mean, that's incredibly gratifying to know that people are embracing this and recognizing it for what it is, which is not a repudiation of EMS or even necessarily the city of Pittsburgh, but a moment to say, hey, this incredible thing happened. And let's, for just for a second, let's So I'll be quiet and listen.
And that's a pretty much a good goal to want to achieve for sure. Take a moment, take this in, breathe it in, and see what it does for you as you learn a bit about a fantastic history, because today, I know when I call, because I've had to make the call, I get paramedics coming to my door, and I know that now there's a legacy behind that, and that legacy was these 24 men who went out there and did it, who brought it to the front. And you yourself are a paramedic, if I'm not mistaken, right? Are you a trained paramedic?
Yeah. I worked 10 years on an ambulance here in the city of Atlanta.
And so that's another aspect of this. You kind of bring your personal touch to this because you've actually done the job. Um, so that must also have been an influencer in this book, or did it have much influence?
Yeah, no, it did. I mean, look, having done this job, and again, for a decade, knowing that 10-year period was this incredibly formative stretch in my life, I felt a debt of gratitude to these guys. I am their progeny in a way. This thing that they helped to create back in the 1960s went on to be this thing that I did in the early 2000s. So, I felt a connection to them in that sense. But then, in terms of just writing, it certainly made it easier. I think it created, a sense of trust between us, because they knew, we've been there, we know, and they were aware that I knew. And so when they would tell stories about, well, this, I intubated this guy, or I showed up and 3 people had been shot. I know what that looks like. I know what that feels like. I know what's going through your mind when you walk through the door on your first day and you're looking at a very sick or injured patient. I know the panic and, the excitement of those moments. And, that certainly helped me to capture them.
Yeah, it certainly did. So what's the next big thing? Are you going to write another book like this, or are you because obviously you've got a bit of writing under your belt. I believe you also got another book or two that's out there. Is this the path now? Are we into being an author?
Yeah, I've got 3 out there now. Working on the 4th, very early days in research, but this is what I wanted to do before I started working on an ambulance. As a young guy, I was a reporter for a newspaper with aspirations of being a writer. 9/11 happened, and sort of much of the U.S. sort of had a spirit of wanting to give back, or to be part, or to help in some kind of way. Unfortunately, it feels like we've lost that, but that's how it felt at that time. And so, I left my job at the newspaper and went to work on an ambulance. Felt compelled to some sort of service. But after 10 years, you now suddenly find myself in my early 30s. It's a very physical job, and I thought, all right, I don't know how long I can do this for. Let me get back into this other thing that was so important to me. So it's very nice to be back as a writer, and I've been doing it now full time since 2014.
And how to really appreciate you taking the time today. How do people find the book and find you if they want to reach out and get in touch with you?
Sure. So the book is anywhere that you can buy books, whether that's a local bookstore, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, whatever outlet you prefer. There's audio then as well as the digital versions too, if you prefer to listen or Kindle it. And then, I'm out in the world. So I'm on Twitter and Instagram, and I do have a website as well, kevinhazzard.com. So I am out there, and always happy to engage with people who, have read the book and want to reach out.
Perfect. Well, it's been really fun talking about this and about the book and yourself as far as doing this. We're going to get this up and out there. This the first one for 2023 in our genre here on Candid Conversations and also on YouTube. So happy to make you the first one for the year. And of course, like I said, I'll make sure that it gets on our blog at oneononecandidconversations.blogspot.com, and of course on YouTube. You'll be able to see a little bit of a blurb about the book, and of course the link to the video, and of course the YouTube channel will also be uploaded as well. This video will be there. And Kevin, thank you so very much for taking the time out to do this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here. And it's great to know I'm the first of 23.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get more in for this year. It's going to be a lot of fun. Kevin, again, a real blast. Thanks again. We'll definitely get this up, and I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.